Yes, I know vlogging through history already covered this. However, I also felt the need to commentate on the video in question because holy fuck, Michael Knowles' presidential tier list was utter nonsense. So this is the ranking Knowles ends his video with, and he's a conservative, so I'm not going to sit here and argue with him over things like Reagan being rated incredibly highly, or FDR being rated low, because those are just a reflection of his politics, and arguing with that would essentially just be me debating his overall views while also just kind of using this as a microcosm. With that said, I do take issue with how absolutely arbitrary these rankings are at certain points. For example, you guys see how Bill Clinton is 2 whole rankings below Bush Sr.? Now, again, Knowles is a conservative. That is an opinion he is entitled to. However, his part on Bill Clinton opens with him saying this.
Bill Clinton was basically just a continuation of George H.W. Bush. They were both liberal, centrist internationalists. There's not much of a difference between them.
But if they're basically the same, shouldn't they be ranked very similarly? Why does Clinton get knocked down 2 notches from Bush if they're so damn similar? Maybe it has to do with Clinton's personal life. After all, Knowles does call Clinton a degenerate.
I guess Clinton was more of a degenerate in his personal life.
But he ranks JFK higher than both Clinton and Bush, despite using the same word to describe Kennedy's personal affairs.
The reason I would put him at Leonidas is, he was a lib, and in his personal life he was a bit of a degenerate.
By the way, Knowles decides to bump Kennedy up a couple of notches because of his anti-communism, to the point where he was even friends with Joseph McCarthy.
He was a staunch anti-communist. He loved Joseph McCarthy. Actually, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, went to Joe McCarthy's funeral. That's how much the Kennedys loved McCarthy. He was the most toughest anti-communist crusader we had.
But he shows no love for Woodrow Wilson, whose attorney general very famously rounded up and deported communists in the late 1910s, and the president who did easily the most to keep Vietnam out of the hands of communists. That's what the Vietnam War was, which was greatly escalated by Lyndon Johnson. Also, no, Kennedy did not love Joseph McCarthy. That is just completely wrong. To quote from Robert Dalick's book, John F. Kennedy in Unfinished Life, 1917 through 1963, the only Senate Democrat not to vote against McCarthy, or more precisely, not to vote on the issue, was Kennedy. Jack had no illusion about the man's ruthlessness and unreliability. In 1953, when a reporter asked what he thought of Joe, he replied, "Not very much, but I get along with him. When I was in the House, I used to get along with Vito Marcantonio and John Rankin," demeaning McCarthy by lumping him with extremists on the left and the right. In January 1953, when Jack heard that his father had arranged for Bobby to be appointed as counsel to McCarthy's subcommittee on investigations, he regretted what his father had done. "Oh, hell, you can't fight the old man," he said in disgust. Jack was especially critical of the false charges McCarthy brought against Foreign Service officers for the loss of China. He dismissed as irrational allegations of communists in the diplomatic corps. In February 1954, he publicly complained of McCarthy's excesses. "You reach the point of diminishing returns in all of these extreme charges and countercharges," he added. By the way, if Kennedy was such a stern anti-communist, somebody should have really told the other stern anti-communists of the era who hated Kennedy. The same day Kennedy was assassinated, the John Birch Society, the leading anti-communist group of the more conspiratorial right wing, infamously put out a flyer declaring that Kennedy should be arrested for treason, for reasons including he has been lax in enforcing communist registration laws, he has given support and encouragement to communist-inspired racial riots, and he has constantly appointed anti-Christians to federal office, upholds Supreme Court in its anti-Christian rulings, aliens and known communists abound in federal offices. Essentially, for a good generation of Republicans during the Kennedy administration and after, the general narrative was,
Nixon was framed and Kennedy was a commie?
That's right.
Also, if anti-communism is so important for Knowles, why is Richard Nixon the man who very famously opened up relations between the United States and Communist China, who at the time was under an authoritarian regime more brutal than the Soviet Union, ranked so highly? Although, to be fair, Nixon did have a record as an anti-communist, however, it's just a weird move. Knowles doesn't talk about Nixon's trip to China. He does say this, though.
He was basically the only person who believed Whittaker Chambers when Whittaker Chambers said that there are commies in the government, up to and including Alger Hiss, who helped found the UN at the State Department, guys like Harry Dexter White at Treasury. Everyone said, oh, you're crazy, this is conspiratorial. No way, all the libs tried to downplay it. But no, there were commies throughout the U.S. government who were taking direct orders from Moscow and who were serving as Soviet spies. So Nixon knew it, he caught it, they never forgave him for it. They never forgave him for taking down Alger Hiss. That's why there were so many shenanigans in 1960, and that's why the deep state stole the election from him, or rather stole the presidency from him after he won re-election later on.
Of course, despite their hatred for Nixon, they still allowed him to become senator from California, as well as vice president for 8 years under Dwight Eisenhower, and served 6 years as president, even if he didn't get to serve out 2 entire terms. Also, some of you have probably noticed by this point that this is not all of the presidents in United States history. It's only 25 of them, in fact. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing bad about leaving out certain presidents who you don't have much to say on, or who just weren't very historically significant. As much as I have issues with Alan Felsenberg's book, The Leaders We Deserved, and a few we didn't, the fact that he didn't rank either William Henry Harrison or James Garfield, along with the then-President George W. Bush, was not an issue with it. I similarly have some massive disagreements with Vlogging Through History's presidential ranking, but I take no issue with his decision to not rate any presidents after Bill Clinton, under the logic that it's just too early to determine where they fall in history. My issue with Knowles' ranking, however, is that it constantly feels like the presidents he chose to include were utterly arbitrary and nonsensical. Neither Theodore Roosevelt nor Harry Truman are put on this list. But he does include both the aforementioned William Henry Harrison and James Garfield, despite both also dying incredibly early on in their tenures as presidents. The section on Harrison, by the way, regurgitates the myth that it was the rain at his inauguration which led to his death.
And he didn't like that he was being insulted on the campaign trail. He didn't like that people were saying he'd lost a step or two. So for his inauguration, he went out it was a rainy, cold day, and he gave a 2-hour-long speech.
All around me are familiar faces.
And they had already trimmed it down. He gave a 2-hour-long speech in the cold and in the rain. He then attended multiple inauguration parties, and he just went out. He really did it up, and then he took sick and he died shortly thereafter.
There's not actually any evidence these two events are related. If anything, it seems more likely it was something similar to typhoid, which he caught by drinking the tainted water outside Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, the segment on James Garfield starts with Knowles not knowing if he was assassinated or not.
Next up, James Garfield, 20th President of the United States. Everybody forgets James Garfield. He also died shortly after he was brought into office. He died, I think he was assassinated. Could be wrong about that. He might have just taken sick and died.
He was assassinated. You could have literally just Googled that if you wanted to. Or even just watched a fucking American Dad episode.
Who's that?
That's Charles Guiteau, the psychopath who tracked President Garfield down like a bloodhound and assassinated him. Guiteau was so crazy, he kept all his toenail clippings in a jar. Here, you can have one.
Meanwhile, the rest of the segment is just Knowles complimenting Garfield for having written a blank book, which that's a phrase if you've ever heard one. For those confused, Knowles is doing a shtick here. Essentially, the joke is that he himself did basically the same thing when he published a book in 2017 called Reasons to Vote for Democrats, A Comprehensive Guide. I don't have an issue with him doing that personally, albeit I do find the bit dragged out, despite not even giving us a joking reason as to why this is important. Seriously, even just a tactic later employed by such people as myself would have been good enough, because otherwise you're leaving the entirety of your audience who doesn't know about the aforementioned trivia confused. I should also note, since I already mentioned the segment on Harrison, that Knowles doesn't judge these presidents just by their term as president, and instead chooses to also focus on other aspects of their lives, begging the question of why he didn't include Ulysses S. Grant, but that's a different topic. Regarding Harrison, for example, he notes,
The reason I really like him, though, is, first of all, he's the hero of Tippecanoe. He was a good, strong American military leader.
Similarly, regarding Andrew Jackson, Knowles feels the need to note,
Andrew Jackson fought wars. He was a war hero, not just against the Indians, but against the British. He was the hero of New Orleans.
What that has to do with his tenure as president, I admittedly have absolutely no idea. And yes, obviously, this is selective as fuck. Jimmy Carter was a lieutenant in the United States Navy during the Second World War. Here is the entire segment about Carter in Knowles' video.
Jimmy Carter, Burger King. Done. That's it. It's easy.
And what about Dwight D. Eisenhower? Well, here Knowles at least acknowledges Eisenhower's military record for, like, a second.
Next up, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was a Republican. He was a war hero.
Meanwhile, the rest of the segment is about how Dwight Eisenhower was a liberal in ways that aren't explained in the slightest, along with how William F. Buckley wasn't the biggest fan of him or something. It's a somewhat interesting piece of history, but it tells you absolutely nothing about Eisenhower's domestic policy or even where he deserves to be placed on this list. What Buckley thought of him is not all that relevant. What do you think of him, Michael Knowles? You're the one making this video. Also, I just need to stress, calling Eisenhower a liberal is just utterly nonsensical. Mind you, he wasn't exactly a conservative either, at least not in the modern sense. He personally called himself a progressive moderate or a dynamic conservative, saying in 1955, "I have tried to find a phrase in which to define what the Republican Party has done at home. I have said we were progressive moderates. Right at the moment, I rather favor the term dynamic conservatism. I believe we should be conservative. I believe we should conserve on everything that is basic to our system. We should be dynamic in applying it to the problems of the day so that all 163 million Americans will profit from it. So for the moment, I would say the record at home has been dynamic conservatism. You can go into the fields of agriculture, of the freedoms that have been restored to our economy, to the tax system, to everything we have done." Dwight Eisenhower considered himself a conservative. This is to be contrasted with somebody like, say, John F. Kennedy, who Knowles says the following about.
On the flip side of that, you have John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was from the more conservative wing, anti-communist wing, of the Democratic Party.
But John F. Kennedy did not consider himself a conservative by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he said in 1960, "If by a liberal they mean someone who looks ahead and not behind, someone who welcomes new ideas without rigid reactions, someone who cares about the welfare of the people, their health, their housing, their schools, their jobs, their civil rights, and civil liberties. Someone who believes we can break through the stalemate and suspicions that grip us in our policies abroad. If that is what they mean by liberal, then I'm proud to say I'm a liberal. Now, we've already talked about the idea that Kennedy was some staunch anti-communist. However, I should also note that, assuming anti-communism refers to an interventionist foreign policy, that was not a universally conservative position, despite Knowles' conflation, until around the Vietnam War. Before that point, lead conservatives were people like Robert Taft, who was a very well-known isolationist. By the way, since you were willing to cite Buckley's dislike of Eisenhower as evidence of him being a liberal, there was another conservative who had far harsher words to say about Kennedy. What was his name again?
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, him. Given he famously wrote on John F. Kennedy in the run-up to the 1960 presidential election, shouldn't someone tag Mr. Kennedy's bold new imaginative program with its proper age? Under the tousled boyish haircut is still old Karl Marx, first launched a century ago. There is nothing new in the idea of a government being big brother to us all. Hitler called it state socialism, and way before him it was benevolent monarchy. Going back to the topic of Knowles not actually discussing what these people did as president, I have not even shown you all the worst example. When he discusses George Washington, he says absolutely nothing about Washington's time as president. Seriously, here's the entire segment on him.
Numero uno, George Washington. George Washington, first president of the United States, no question whatsoever, he is King Arthur. He may actually be the reincarnation of King Arthur. The indispensable man, loved lots of the founding fathers. He was the best among them. Without George Washington, there would not be a United States of America, I'm pretty confident to say. So he's the one, he gets the top spot, no surprise there.
I mean, that's all amazing, don't get me wrong, but what did he actually do? Not even as president in that case, just in general. Seriously, Knowles gives absolutely no specifics on the life of George Washington in that part of the video. He just says Washington was great and then moves on. I agree with that statement, don't get me wrong, but shouldn't a video ranking presidents actually have more concrete reasons? Also, if we're discussing people who, without them, there wouldn't be a United States of America, your section on Thomas Jefferson should probably at least mention the Declaration of Independence. Just saying. Seriously, are we ranking these people as presidents? Or are we instead ranking them based off of who they were throughout their lives? This video is rather confusing and not all that well thought out, but let's get into some factual inaccuracies.
The other thing I really like about John Adams, other than he was a conservative and a real conservative, he defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre because he felt that they were in the right and that the way the press had been covering this was not fair.
I mean, that was part of it, but the main reason he chose to do such was because he felt everyone was entitled to a legal defense, including those who many people felt were utterly repugnant.
Republicans right now, by the way, can learn something from Chester Arthur in the way that he handled the immigration question. Because, Republicans have this thing where we want to have national borders, we want to control who gets to come into the country, we want there to be national unity, of course, every country wants to do that. But in the United States, if you say that you want to enforce very basic laws of immigration, you're called a racist.
That's racist!
And Chester Arthur, there was a big immigration law that came up during his presidency in 1882, and he vetoed the first version of the bill because he felt that it would have been punitive and violated some treaties. And so he sent it back, and then there was another bill that came to his desk, which was, a little bit more moderate in its immigration policies, and he signed that one into law. So you can be tough on it without falling into bigotry or racism or something like that.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was a horribly racist piece of legislation that only became law because of xenophobic fears surrounding Chinese immigrants.
And then we get to very possibly the worst president in the history of the United States, Woodrow Wilson.
I mean, all presidents, technically speaking, are possibly the worst because that's just what the word possibly means. With that said, given you don't even give Wilson the lowest ranking in your tier list, it's very obvious you personally believe there are presidents that were worse, so what was up with this opening?
Woodrow Wilson only became president, by the way, because Teddy Roosevelt wanted to come back into power, so he split the conservatives who would have been voting for his successor, Taft, and that by splitting the right gave Woodrow Wilson a way to enter the White House and destroy our country.
The conservatives were not going to vote for Roosevelt, though, as they were perfectly happy with a Taft administration that was in many ways to the right of Theodore. That is what caused Theodore Roosevelt to run for president in 1912 in the first place, beginning with his attempt to get the Republican nomination before splitting off and forming his own third party, literally called the Progressive Party.
Wilson is the most consciously progressive president in American history.
And not the president who literally wrote a book called Progressive Principles. Okay, odd choice in my opinion.
Next up, Franklin Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States. This one kills me because on the one hand, he's the most effective president we've ever had. He was a king. He made himself a king, whereas someone like Calvin Coolidge would rather leave office than stay in office longer than George Washington. Roosevelt, he wanted to stay there 4 terms. He would have stayed there longer had he not died.
Yes, Roosevelt did quite possibly the most nefarious thing a politician could do, run for re-election.
So the Cold War had roiled the United States for the latter part of the 20th century. We win it. Reagan wins it. The Berlin Wall comes down. And George H.W. Bush, instead of focusing on the cultural new Cold War that was going on in the United States, he decided to look abroad. And famously, you saw this when in the 1992 Republican nominating convention, there were 2 candidates, Pat Buchanan, who was the social conservative, and George H.W. Bush, who was the liberal Republican. And in the speeches, Buchanan gave the famous culture war speech, which I talk about in my book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. And George H.W. Bush talked about how the real fight now is to just make a lot of money, and we need to control the markets around the world. So we made some more money and we lost the whole culture. It's too bad.
Bush did attempt to appeal to cultural conservatives, though. It may not have been as big of an aspect of his presidency as you personally would have liked, but it was certainly part of it. He even took on network television shows on a few occasions. See this famous clip from Bush regarding The Simpsons.
Well, let me tell you something. We are going to keep on trying to strengthen the American family, to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons.
Along with this incredibly infamous clip of then Vice President Dan Quayle criticizing the television show Murphy Brown.
It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice.
Anyway, I'm ranking this video rather lowly, if you couldn't figure that out. Good night, and good luck.